when we started doing work back in the 80s, we'd often have 2, 3, 4-day workshops. Now it became 2 days, then one day, then, it's sort of like people looking for instant pudding. And so the net of it was, while we could talk broadly about diversity, we weren't getting very deeply into any of the particular topics. Now, over time, certain things would rise to the surface. But in 2014, for example, after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, all of a sudden the topic of unconscious bias just exploded, and everybody wanted to talk about unconscious bias. And then, obviously, a couple of years ago, when the Me Too movement came up, a lot of people wanted to focus more on gender. And now we're in a situation where, because of the George Floyd killing and the subsequent racial unrest or I would say call for racial justice might be a better way of putting it, has emerged. There are an awful lot of people who realize maybe it's time for us to finally have a deeper talk about race in some of our organizations. First of all, we know that, sadly, diversity has been stuck right in the middle of our political process. And some of that has to do with the pure demographics. And that is, if we look at the demographics of our political process, we know that, one party, the Democrats, has got a very diverse population, a very diverse voter base, and the Republicans, is mostly white, overwhelmingly white. And so what that means is that the call for diversity feels like it fits into that political structure. And at the heart of it, what we're trying to do with our diversity work is we're trying to really to fulfill the vision of the American dream, that all people are created equal, that all people should have a right to not just equal justice, but also to equal opportunity in our society. And that's really been the thrust right from the beginning. I think that people misinterpret that often. We've all been raised in a culture that creates what Bryan Stevenson, the great civil rights lawyer, calls a narrative of racial difference. And that narrative of racial difference has placed certain people at the top and certain people in lower statuses, depending upon where we are in the country and the like. And what we're trying to do is to lift it up. But, look, it's no secret that when we look at what's going on in our society, that there's a disturbing rise in white supremacy coming out into the open. And I think some of it's directed towards diversity training. I think unconscious bias is an important component of this, because in a way, unconscious bias is the connective tissue of all the dynamics we're dealing with. We've been trained over the course of our lives to feel comfortable with certain people and less comfortable with others, to attribute more positive qualities to some people and less quality to others, and that's how it plays out. We have to take some responsibility. I think those of us who teach this work, who take it out into the world, have to take some responsibility for the fact that we haven't always done a good job of communicating about things like white privilege in a systemic way. It's been too often done more personally. Like, you have white privilege and you have white privilege. Now, it does show up personally, but it's a systemic issue. It's like you go out in a rainstorm. It's not a personal rainstorm, but you get personally wet. But to say that you're accountable for the rainstorm would be silly. White privilege is a function of the system that we were just talking about. I mean, one thing that is often a best practice is that we not throw all of our eggs in one basket, and that we don't, make diversity training the only time we talk about diversity. I think that, the best organizations I know talk about it when they're doing leadership training. They talk about it when they're doing team building. They talk about it when they're talking about their corporate culture. In other words, it infuses the whole organization. Make sure that the training is relevant to the company, and it's not just relevant to the trainer or the consultant who's doing it, but that it actually speaks to the needs, the concerns, and the lived experience of people in the company. We're trying to change the culture of an organization. We're not just trying to teach people something, we're trying to actually change the culture. So let's say you get best education in the world, you learn about diversity and inclusion and belonging and unconscious bias and all these kinds of things, but then you don't have to do a performance review for 4 months. What are the odds you're going to remember it? Not great. So this is where we often encourage people to use nudging techniques. And then we also want to look at our structures and systems, and we can see how certain structures and systems can be modified to make them more bias resistant. The fourth one is to be sure that you're creating the right kind of structure for accountability, so that you could be actually tracking how you're doing, because often the only thing we have is how many are there, and that's not really very helpful in terms of knowing where the breakdown is. So this is why I really emphasize this whole concept of belonging, because we know that the desire to belong is a key fundamental human need together. And when we build cultures in which people have a full sense of belonging and everybody has a seat at the table, that's when we have cultures that can be really successful.